there aren't very many differences between design thinking in Web3 or in Web2. In both instances, you are trying to understand user needs and
NEWFORUM, the community podcast that invites purpose-driven visionaries, developers, creators, and investors to spark accessible conversations on the topics of crypto, the metaverse, NFT, and everything Web3 brings you an incredible founder and visionary, Jads Esber. Jad is a co-founder and CEO of Koodos, a VC-backed Web3 company. He's also an affiliate at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard and fellow at the Plattman Coops Consortium at the New School. He builds, writes, and speaks on the topic of social spaces, creative tools, and their intersections with decentralized technologies. His interests cover digital identity, reputation systems, consumer marketplaces, curation, and internet culture. He was previously at Google and YouTube, where he worked with and built for creators and artists in emerging markets and earned a Bachelor and Master in Engineering from the University of Cambridge and an MBA from Harvard, where he was also a Sainsbury Management Fellow, led the Entrepreneurship Club, and spent time as a fellow at Lightspeed, Pear VC, and Unshackled. What a rich background you've got, Jad, and we're honored to have you on this episode of NEWFORUM. You're like such an incredible design thinker, and I mean, I can't wait to begin the conversation with you.
Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to get into the conversation.
So I think my first question for you would be, what would you say is the difference between design thinking in Web3 and Web2? And what are the most important things for you now when it comes to designing in Web3?
Yeah, so I think there aren't very many differences between design thinking in Web3 or in Web2. In both instances, you are trying to understand user needs and trying to kind of unravel how best to find solutions that resolve those needs, regardless of what the technology is. In Web3, the interesting part is that a lot of the backend, if you will, is shared infrastructure that you can rely on or contribute for other people to build on. And so a lot of the focus in Web3 when it comes to building apps for consumers tends to focus on more of the UI and UX, which means that there is an even bigger focus on solving needs and building things that people love, because they can take their stuff, their data, and move into other spaces. And so a big part of ensuring that you're building something competitive and that you keep your users is resolving core needs. So I think if anything, the difference is in Web3, design thinking and understanding needs and building for those needs is even more important.
I read a quote on your Twitter 1 year ago. You said, I was sitting in my favorite professor's class learning about marketplace design and dreaming up Koodos. Today, we're excited to share our tokenomics essay for A16Z's future and a framework to help Web3 platforms design reputation systems. And I'm curious to know what was going through your mind right at that moment. Like, what was the problem you were looking to solve as you were dreaming up the vision of Koodos? And then maybe you can give us an overview of your tokenomics essay for A16Z's future and a framework, and also what has changed since writing that.
Yeah, wow, it's a very broad, big question. So I'll try and break it down into two parts. So the first is, what were the things that were going through my mind as I was dreaming up Koodos? And the second part is to tell you a little bit more about the essay. So maybe just to kind of like rewind a little bit and tell you about my childhood. So I grew up writing poetry online anonymously. I was very confused about my identity growing up. I come from a mixed background. I moved around a lot. And so I turned to the internet, like many kids, to figure out who I was. And I did that by writing poetry. And the poetry I wrote ended up becoming context for other people to reach out. And so I made a lot of friends online growing up. And I share that because for me, the internet has always been a place for identity exploration and connection. And so that's been a big part of my focus in my career and my life since my childhood. So that's sort of one thing that was on my mind. I think the other thing that was on my mind is when I was at YouTube, I spent some time thinking about remixing and tools for remixing. So this idea that like, as you come across things on the platform, as you're watching content on YouTube, when you feel inspired, you can take a snippet and like build on it and create new content based on it. And so this idea that like we can be inspired as we're consuming and like actively creating, and that process being a way for us to kind of like explore our identity and express ourselves and connect with others was sort of like something that I was very inspired by. So that's what I was thinking about, in the early days. The article or the piece that I wrote with Professor Kominers came about because we were very concerned about how people were designing token systems and the kind of over indexing on financial incentives, to kind of like anchor that. And a lot of systems were very focused on giving people a token and like number go up being the main incentive that people stuck around. And so we wanted to write a kind of a piece that provides another framework for people to rely on. And the main summary of the piece is that, we recommend that systems, reputation systems, offer two tokens. One is a non-transferable reputation-based token. So it's kind of like getting points in a game. And another that's a financial token that's kind of like when points earn you coins in a game that you can spend. And so there's just that distinction between a non-transferable points-based system and sort of that spinning off a more financial incentive was what we were kind of trying to advocate for. And the kind of focus here being on figuring out like the product market fit before you start introducing financial incentives. So you can rely entirely on a points-based system and then slowly start to kind of add financial incentives deeper into the process of building this system that you're building. So that's sort of the main gist of it. There's a lot more in the piece. I'd recommend reading it if it's of interest to you.
Yeah, I actually started reading it. I need to finish it. And also for our sort of like newcomers, I'd say within the community, like how would you maybe define like a simple way to define tokenomics, just so that they can process what you said?
Yeah, sure. I mean, let's talk about games. So if you remember when you're a game that you like growing up, likely there was some sort of point system. So like as you played, you gain points based on how you're doing in the game. And maybe in that game, there's also a way for you to like get coins that you can spend on like upgrades or skins or whatever it is in the game. So coins are kind of like financial tokens because you can spend them on things. In a game, it's within the confines of that game. In the world of kind of like crypto, the coin you can use outside the kind of like closed system that you're operating in. So that's like a very simple way of thinking about it. Points are like a non-transferable token because you can't give your points to someone else, like they're tied to you. So that's sort of another way of thinking about it.
And also you published an article, a quote written with your favorite professor, Scott Duke Kominers, published in Harvard Business Review titled Why Build in Web3? And like a little paragraph that says it's based on the premise that there's an alternative to exploiting users for data to make money. And that instead, building open platforms that share value with users directly will create more value for everyone, including the platform. I'm just like curious to know, like, how do we compete with, with the tech giants who would rather control data? And how does it be like the blockchain kind of maybe fix all of this?
Yeah, I don't think the blockchain fixes all of this. I mean, I think to kind of like define Web3 a little bit, like, this might be overly simple way of describing it, but Web3 is simply what comes after Web2, like the number 3 comes after 2. So, it will succeed because it's just this next iteration of what we know as the consumer internet. It could be based on blockchains, it might not. I think a lot of the energy that is in like the crypto or Web3 space will likely spawn what becomes next, but I don't think it's necessarily because of blockchains. I think the momentum around building more open, shared infrastructure and collective ownership is really interesting. And obviously blockchains provide or enable some of that, but there are other technologies that also enable that to an extent. And so that's just sort of like how I would think about Web3. I'm not a maximalist in terms of the technology, but I am in terms of just general momentum away from exploiting users' data without their consent to make money. And so, yeah, I think, in the piece that I wrote in HBR, co-wrote with Professor Kominers, we outline some of the interesting opportunities around, I described this earlier, but relying on shared infrastructure. So for example, a lot of people are thinking about how social graphs can be ported over from one platform to another, which means that you can really innovate on the front end or like the user experience side of things and bring kind of the social graph that you have on one platform into the other. And so a lot of what developers and builders can start thinking about is how do I build the best possible experience for users so that they volunteer and choose to use this platform versus another. It's not about, hey, I'm just going to lock all your data in here and you have to come use this app. That doesn't become sort of the focus anymore.
Whenever I think about this concept of like data being controlled, being locked up, and I guess currently everyone thinks of that as a Web2 thing, right? And so what is Web3 without crypto, without blockchain?
I think I would describe Web3 again more as the momentum, like the developer momentum and the direction of shared infrastructure, like open kind of like more open source type ways of building and collective ownership. Blockchains are currently like how people think about enabling a lot of that. And so that's why like a lot of people anchor on the technology there. But I think when I try to think about what's interesting here, I would describe it more as this general movement or momentum away from the current way of doing things, and that blockchains are one of the main technologies that enable sort of this future.
I like that explanation. Honestly, I think maybe you're the first person who has defined Web3 in this way, and so quite insightful. Also, so assuming that people want to make money from a social system invites speculators, how do we create relational capital via sentiments or psychological ownership over an asset or community? And the need for two token systems, one that's based on reputation and another that's based on financial, sorry.
Yeah, so we talked a little bit about this and we talked about the two token system.
Right.
I think what I meant by this is specifically that, if you think about how apps compete in this new world, I mentioned this idea that users need to really love, this app in order to stay on it. A feeling of like a relationship with this product or app, or like that I have some form of psychological ownership over this product or app in order for me to keep coming to it and using it. And so what one of my hypotheses is like one of the biggest moats in Web3 is essentially how much relational capital or psychological ownership a product can engender. So if I feel like this product is an extension of my identity, I feel a sense of ownership over it in some way, perhaps because it's very customizable, it feels like my own, perhaps it's the community that sort of aggregates around it. That makes me want to kind of go back and use it. And so that's sort of what I mean by creating like relational capital, or like sentiments of psychological ownership, that being one of the core ways that you can keep people coming to your product or service.
This idea of the like sort of online or the metaverse, for instance, being this extension of our identity, and how you spoke about the fact that like perhaps maybe even saved you in a way when you're growing up, right? I think that is really inspiring. The only challenge that I have is most people, especially from the emerging market, because I know that you worked on projects for that, like how do we ensure that all of this is accessible for them?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a that's a great question. I think a lot of technologies end up being built for an American audience or a Western audience, and then sort of become localized into other contexts. I think there is an understanding today that a lot of power users don't live in the Bay Area, and there is a requirement to kind of start thinking about those users at the outset and designing systems with them in mind. And I think we're seeing that we're seeing a lot of technology start in the East and also start moving West. I think one great example is TikTok, started in China, and sort of like migrated West. So yeah, I think the main takeaway here is just, if you're building something for a global audience, consider the global audience early, ensure they are co-creators and contributing user insights at the earliest stages, so that it's shaped around their needs and they're not second class citizens in the world that you're building.
I also want to know, what is this idea of how we can encode the context of on-chain in terms of like understanding, the challenges when it comes to like the ecosystems?
So I think right now, as we sort of like go about our lives online, there are a lot of experiences that we have, whether it's when it's consuming a video that resonates, listening to a song that sort of makes us feel something, reading an article that provides us with this like amazing insight that we end up relying on or referencing or using in sort of another work. That experience, that context that lives around our consumption of media online isn't something that we've been able to really capture and leverage in ways to make products better. There's obviously a whole suite of ways that Web2 big platforms try to understand context without us telling them, and that's been powerful in some ways, but also exploitative in many other ways. And so I think that there's a lot of interesting work happening around how we might capture proactively what someone thinks about something or feels about something, and encoding that context alongside the content that's being consumed, and that providing the user with a lot of really interesting and important data, but also the system with really important and interesting data. And so ways in which we can do that, where the context that's being encoded or kind of like generated by users proactively, living in some form of shared infrastructure where other people can contribute context as well in their own apps and systems, but also this like shared infrastructure becoming something that people can read from and like build experiences on top of, I think is really powerful. And that's one of the main questions that we've been exploring recently at Koodos as well. So yeah, that's what I meant by to the context that lives around content or media on the internet.
Mm-hmm. I was also curious if you could maybe tell us more about Koodos, because I feel like we didn't really get into it. I know that looking at the amazing team, I'm telling you guys, you need to check out the website. the vision, just to, even if it's just to see the cute characters. It's amazing. I love it. And I know that you guys strive, right? You're dedicated to creating a safe and positive online world. And how has that been? I mean, that's not an easy, an easy job, I would say. And how's that going?
Yeah, for sure. So, I talked a lot about building spaces that feel like they're extensions of your identity, that feel like, almost a place that's really truly yours, almost like a sanctuary. And that's something that we've been focused on when it comes to building the Koodos app. We want it to feel like it's a place where you can bring the things that you love from across the web and really kind of punctuate them with your context and your commentary, and that they can live in a space that feels like a bedroom. It's like walking into your bedroom and like seeing the things that you love in this space, and things that you own all in this space. And so that's sort of what we focus on when it comes to the Koodos app. But I think the broader mission that we are working on is this question of, well, now with this information around what people love, the media that people love, that they're bringing into these spaces and the context that they're adding to it, how can we build some form of shared infrastructure that other people can also write to and read from? And that's sort of been the big question that we've been trying to untangle as of recently. So, in summary, we're building an app and a protocol that focuses on media that people love on the internet.
Is there a future of the, I guess, stereotypical concept of the metaverse? Are you guys thinking about creating a world as well, like that people can have their avatars and just really live this identity, this extension?
I mean, potentially. That's not something when I reference or talk about the app, I think of it more as a wallet. So it's more as a space for you that is yours, and you're collecting these possessions essentially in this space. So I tend to, like, the framework that I have is more a wallet. I think generally the metaverse, we're already living in it, kind of the more co-present experiences and the more embodied experiences that might become more realistic over time online, I think are really interesting and potentially could start to kind of manifest within the core app. But that's not something that we're like exploring right now.
So my last question for you, Jad, is what keeps you inspired? What keeps you going in this space, I guess, this evolving space? How is it to maybe work with a co-founder and get a team together? I know culture is really important to you as a person.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm generally inspired by people and primarily by the team I'm working with. And the users and community that we built for. We care a lot about making sure that we are co-creating with our community and like really like including them in the process of building what we're building. And I'm very privileged to be working with an incredible team. And every day I'm inspired by the ideas they have and like what they're doing and how they're doing it, and I feel like I'm growing alongside them. So that's where I derive a lot of my inspiration. I think beyond that, I'm very lucky to also be in community with a lot of really amazing people. We referenced Professor Kominers, but also I'm very lucky to be mentored and taught by so many amazing people in this space, the likes of Evan Sharp from Pinterest and Suchit, who was from Dubsmash and now at Reddit, but also a lot of crypto and Web3 builders and investors, the likes of Kinjal from Blockchain Capital, the folks at IDEO VC, and many, many others that I'm forgetting to name now, but they inspire me and I learn a lot from them too.
Wow, I mean, they're obviously great mentors because you are amazing, and you're doing such a great thing. And I know I said this was my last question, but I cannot help but ask this, like, what does it mean to co-create with the community? You know, because sometimes I feel like we throw that around a lot.
Yeah, I think it's very simple. It's making sure that you're listening to them, and listening not to kind of like build a feature list, but rather like really listening to kind of understand core needs, and observing. And sort of like what I mean by observe is kind of living in the spaces that they live in, whether that means seeing how they interact with what you've built, but also going and occupying a lot of the spaces that they're in to observe and learn. And so I'd say it's like listening and observing is one way, but then also ensuring that you are, you know, checking in with them. Like, how do you feel about this? What do you think about this? Getting feedback from them regularly and talking to them. The biggest question and balance here is around how much is user feedback shaping your roadmap. You know, I think it should inform your roadmap, but not shape it. I think so you have to be really careful around listening, observing, collecting feedback, and then sort of making decisions based on all of those inputs and providing the community with a logic and like first principle thinking that may allow you to make the decision that you're making when and if that, you know, makes sense. So that's sort of how I would describe it.
Amazing. Before you share where our amazing community can find you on your social platforms, I'd like to know what are some of the tools that you're using in terms of co-creating with the community. Like, I know one of the famous ones would be Discord, but I don't know Discord. Okay.
I think Discord is one. I think, you know, obviously, you know, Zoom, we do a lot of user interviews, but I think beyond tools, actually like intentionally going to the spaces that they're in. What I mean by that is if it's an online space, you know, becoming a part of the communities that they are a part of. If it's physical spaces, actually going and like being in that space. So for example, you know, a lot of our users are college aged and they decorate their bedrooms in real life. And so one thing that we did was we went to a bunch of dorm rooms and visited them and talked to users there. And had them give us tours of their dorms. So I think it's also, you know, that's not necessarily a digital tool, but I think an important aspect of really kind of being with the user that I think is important.
Well said. Thank you so much, Jad. Where can we find you on your social platform?
Yeah, so you can find Koodos at Koodos on Twitter. And then you can find me at Jad_AE on Twitter.
Thank you so much. And we will have all his links in the description below. Also, thank you all so much for being a part of today's forum. If you want to get more involved in our community, make sure to follow us on our social platforms. Twitter is NEWFORUM_NCO. You can also join our Discord community to connect with our guests. You'll find the link in the chat as well. Thank you all, and take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. And we will see you in the next episode. Thank you.